So, part of what I love about what's happening here in these few days is that you guys are living at the intersection of faith and work. And I don't know if there's a more profound way to have an impact on the world than to have your ministry be your work and intersect it with your faith. Dallas Willard says that work is our primary place of discipleship. By its very nature, even though you may value your family more, very often the nature of work requires an inordinate amount of time. And it is in this place of work that our primary discipleship takes place. I'm going to read to you another quote from Dallas Willard that's just one of my favorites. He says this: "Faith is a vision that our destiny is to be absorbed in a tremendously creative team effort with unimaginably splendid leadership on an inconceivably vast plane of activity, with ever more comprehensive cycles of productivity and enjoyment, and this is what eye has not seen nor ear heard that was spoken about in the prophetic vision." We have a remarkable opportunity before us as business people and Christ followers to make a difference in the world. And what I want to talk about this morning very briefly are two things that I think we often overlook and underuse in a way to have impact in the world as Christ followers. The first is our values, and the second is conflict. So I'm going to talk about values for a few minutes, then I'm going to switch over to conflict, and we're going to unpack very practically and theoretically what this might look like. Our values, and most companies, if you go into their HR department, can pull a dusty notebook off the shelf and open it up to a page of values that somebody at one time or another gave some thought to. Typically, there are too many. For core values to make a difference in an organization, they need to be 5 or less. Probably optimal is 3 to 4 words that describe your values. And rather than sit on a notebook on a shelf, they need to be lived out every single day. Our values are what help us decide who we will be while we do what we're called to do. They become our ethical guidelines to help us to grow into the kind of people that we want to be. Here's a really interesting thing about values. You will know that you are living out your values in your business when those values inflict pain. That's one of the hallmark qualities of values. They inflict pain because they limit your decision making. I'm going to give you an example from our family life, and then I'm going to give you an example from the business world to kind of bring this home. How values inflict pain. A couple of years ago, we had moved back from Chicago to California, and I'm from California, so I told John, I'm never leaving the state again. This is where I will die. And our 3 kids were in various stages in their development, kind of for and against the move back to California. They were having to give up a lot. 2 or 3 years into our move back to California, our oldest daughter, Laura, and our youngest son, Johnny, got some devastating news considering that they were at the time in high school and in college. One of their friends, their mutual friends back in Chicago at 19 years old, had died very suddenly, very unexpectedly. My youngest son, Johnny, was friends with her and very close with her then boyfriend. My oldest daughter, Laura, was best friends with the girl who died's brother. And so our middle daughter, Mallory, didn't know any of the players involved, so we began to talk to Laura and Johnny about what you do in a situation like this. The first thing we said to Johnny, who was still living at home and in high school, was you go, you show up. You're with your friends, and you're in high school. We're going to pay for the plane flight. And then because my son is an introvert, so he's 25 now, I tell him, you're 25, that's 14 in girl years, just to keep it in perspective. And he's enough of an introvert that I think he was a little scared to go back, like, what do I do? So we went through a couple of things. I was like, eye contact will be very important, Johnny. Let's start practicing right now. Take a look in my eyes. The first thing you do is you hug him. You tell him you are so sorry and that you're here for him. And then the second thing is you look to do whatever needs to be done behind the scenes that nobody else can do. Pick people up at the airport. Go pick up food. Just be there for him. Now, Laura overheard all this, but Laura had graduated from college. And so very difficultly and gingerly, we had to tell Laura that although we thought the right thing for her to do was to go and to be there, that we wouldn't be funding the trip. And I got to tell you, that was one of the most difficult conversations we've had with our oldest daughter. And because she's an oldest daughter, she has lawyer-like tendencies, and she began to fight with us on every turn about that's not fair, why would you do that for Johnny? Making a really good case on paper. But John and I had discussed it before, and we said, we know this is hard, but listen, your friend will understand that not everybody at your age can afford to fly back. You're no different than a lot of your friends. There are ways to support somebody in a situation like this from afar, and we went through some of those. But we left it in her hands to make the decision. Now, she left very mad at us. That's another tough thing about values, is allowing somebody to be angry with you and give them the space to process it separately from you. All of our instincts want to go and make it easy and make the conflict go away so that our anxiety goes down. And then we prematurely exempt them from the kind of learning that they need to do. So we let her go. 2 days later, she said, here's what I can do is I can write him a letter, I can send him an email, I'll get him a certificate for something, I'll pray for him. I said, Laura, that's great. A couple days later, she came back and she said, I don't know what I was thinking, but I'm going. I've looked at my schedule for the next couple months, and I realize if I don't buy any new clothes or shoes for the next 2 months, and I cut back on Starbucks to once or twice a week, I can afford to go. I got to tell you, I don't know that I've had as many moments of being proud of a child that I did in that moment. John, too. We insisted that she had to decide at this stage in her life what her values were, and to differentiate herself from us as parents and inflict the pain on herself, because that's what solidifies the values. Well, that's great to understand how that works in a family situation. How does that work in a business situation? So when we moved to California 10 years ago, John took the job of being the head pastor at Menlo Park Presbyterian Church. I knew that at least for the near future, I was not going to go back on staff and work at a church, and I was very interested in leadership consulting. And so I had written chapters in a book with Patrick Lencioni. I had been very impacted by his books. If you haven't read them, I highly recommend everything he's written: 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, Death by Meetings, his new one, The Advantage. When we were on staff in Chicago, John woke up one night in the middle of the night at 3 o'clock in the morning, and I was under the covers with a flashlight reading The 5 Obsessions of an Extraordinary Executive. And John's like, what are you doing? I was like, oh, I'm in pain. I've made every mistake in this book, and I need to get better, but there's hope in this book. So I contacted Patrick, who lives in the Bay Area and works in the Bay Area. When I first moved there, he invited me over for lunch. He was just starting his Consulting Partners program. It's an invitation only. That's how he builds his stable of consultants. And he said, after I show you around and tell you a little bit about what we do, let's go to lunch, and I'd like to talk to you about this program I'm starting. So we got to lunch, and he was excitedly going on and on about it, and my heart rate was beating faster because this is what I love to do. And I remember the first question I asked him when he got done explaining to me the program. I said, what are your core values? Now, I've asked this question to lots of people. Some of them stammer around, and some of them make things up on the spot, and some of them answer pretty well. And Patrick just said immediately, oh, that's easy. We're humble, hungry, and smart. I went home that afternoon and said to John, is it okay if I'm in love with Patrick Lencioni? And he said, is it similar to your crush on David Letterman? I said, exactly. He's like, sure, not a problem, not a problem. I have told John, if David Letterman ever knocks on my door, I'm leaving him and going with him. And he keeps saying, sure, honey, if he ever knocks on your door, you can go. It's a little marital joke. So Patrick, humble, hungry, and smart, and for some reason, those words captured my soul. They don't have to capture your soul, but you got to have 3 words that get you up every morning. Now, the beauty of humble, hungry, and smart was over the next 10 years, I have watched repeatedly Patrick and everybody in his organization live out those goals, limit their business choices, turn down business, and go in certain directions with those values as their guidelines. I think also part of the resonance with me around those 3 words was something that I had experienced as an emergency room nurse years before. I worked down in the emergency department. I loved the work that I did. I felt like every day I came to work, I learned something new. There was one doctor in particular that when I came on at my 3 o'clock shift in the afternoon, if I saw his name up on the board as our leader that day, I knew you're going to have a great day. Why? Because this doctor had the most incredible capacity to make a team in the moment out of a disparate group of people and make us function on a higher level than we normally would function, quite seamlessly. If you know anything about the emergency room, there's a small core of us that work together on a regular basis, but in a code situation, we call in respiratory and laboratory and x-ray, and we have people trying to save a person, and we don't even know their first names, and we have to work together as a team. And this doctor, who happened to be a Christ follower, better than any other doctor in the emergency room, had the ability to make us a team and elevate our capacity to do great work. One of the things he would do often in a code situation, if it was appropriate and if there was time, perhaps we were waiting for results to come back to direct us on what our next choices would be, he would say, Nancy, if you had to make the next call, if the pH comes back like this, what will we do? He would talk to X-ray about, would you put the chest tube in now or later? He was constantly teaching us. And he treated every single person on the team as we were all of equal value to him in what we had to contribute. Now, that's a rare gift, and I think particularly that's a gift that a Christian leader has to bring to the workplace. How I saw this in operation one evening, we had a young woman come in. She was probably 24, came in around 8 o'clock at night in a code situation. We worked on her for 2.5 hours before we knew whether we were going to send her downstairs to the morgue or upstairs to the intensive care unit. Again, like I mentioned, there was a disparate group of people. Most of us didn't know each other. This doctor was orchestrating our work every step along the way, asking us questions. He had an intern with him. At the end of 2.5 hours, we had stabilized her enough that a team of nurses and x-ray techs took her upstairs to the ICU. I stayed back to finish up the notes, and the doctor was coaching the intern. This is another great leadership move. He used this teaching opportunity in the moment to spend about 15 minutes with his intern reviewing every step that they had made and asking him questions on why he had made these choices to really embed the learning. As I was writing the notes, I was also doing something that nurses are famous for, and that is eavesdropping on what the doctor and the intern were saying. And I listened in amazement as he got to the end of his 15 minutes debriefing this intern all around the medical choices. And then the last question he asked the intern was this: did you notice the guy who came in from housekeeping at the end of the code and cleaned this room up? Well, you could tell by the look on the intern's face that not only did he not notice the guy, he was quite confused as to why he was being asked this question. It had nothing to do with being an intern in the medical field. And as soon as my doctor saw the look on this guy's face, he pressed him further. He said, his name is Carlos, and he's one of the best guys on the housekeeping team. No response. The doctor continued. Carlos gets in here after this room looks like an explosion went off in it, and he turns it around faster than anybody I know and gets everything back in place so that the next critical patient that comes in, we're ready to work on. So then my doctor moves over to the intern and puts his arm around him and squeezes it, pats him on the shoulder. He said, tell you what, here's your assignment for next Tuesday when we work together again. I want you to come to your ER shift next Tuesday ready to tell me something about Carlos that I don't already know. Yeah. And then, just to twist the knife a little more, he said, by the way, Carlos's wife's name is Maria. They have 4 children. He named every one of the children's names. He said Carlos and Maria came up from Mexico 3 years ago to have a better life from their children. They live in a small apartment complex about a mile away in Santa Ana. So this guy was going to have to dig to find something that he didn't know already about Carlos. And I kept writing notes, but inside I was going, yes, this is just a brilliant leadership moment. The value that this doctor had that I had seen, that everybody on the team is as important as anybody else, I just saw play out in real time with somebody who didn't get the value. And the doctor was willing to go the extra mile in the conversation and the homework assignment to make sure that not only did this guy know how and when to put in a chest tube, but he also knew how to value the housekeeping guy on the team in the emergency department. Our values make a huge difference. And when we use them in the front end of hiring people, we begin to communicate that these are not just something that sit in a notebook, but they really do guide us all the time. When we talk about them in our one-on-ones, in our meetings, in our staff gatherings, when we give awards and rewards based on people living out the values, we declare as Christian leaders in the marketplace that not only will we make a difference and impact in the world through our business, but we will make a difference in the kinds of people we are as we do the work that we've been called to do. So make your values mean something. There's a Harvard Business Review article by Pat Lencioni entitled that, Make Your Values Mean Something. If you want more resources on that, I would highly recommend that. The last thing I want to talk about is conflict. I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this because I think as Christian leaders, either in the church or in the marketplace, we tend to suck at this pretty badly. We tend to mistake being sweet and nice all the time for being Christ-like. And that is not the Gospels. That is not Scripture at all. I have a woman in our church, and she and I had a conversation a couple years ago about an older gentleman in our church that we just both really think very highly of. And I said to her, well, Kathy, I know why I love him. Why do you love him? And she said, well, I love him because he reminds me of Jesus. And I said, wow, I really love him, but he doesn't remind me. Why does he remind you of Jesus? And I'll never forget what she said. She said, because he's so sweet and nice all the time. I said, are we talking about the same Jesus? Because here's what I'd love you to do, Kathy. Get a blank piece of paper and draw a line down the middle. And go back and just read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And every time Jesus says something sweet, like you're beautiful, don't ever change, let's do lunch, put a little tick on the left-hand side of the page. And every time he says something that you might be tempted to give your kid a timeout for, you're not worthy of the crumbs I brush off the table to feed my dogs, put a little tick on the right-hand side of the page. And you will see very quickly that what Jesus was a master at was not being sweet and nice all the time, but knowing when to use a word of encouragement and blessing, and knowing when, perhaps more often, to use a difficult conversation to get to the issues of what most deeply need changing in us. Jesus knew how to use conflict as a developmental tool. And both in our spiritual formation attempts and in our leadership, I think we lean so far away from this very profound tool that actually does change that lasts. Conflict is absolutely necessary both to make great decisions and to spiritually form people and to build great teams. Ironically, the very thing that we need, we often go to great lengths to avoid, and leaders, first of all, above everybody, must grow in our ability to make sure that we are having the right kind of conflict on a team and to be very comfortable ourselves with getting that conflict out in the open. Now, your comfortability in dealing with conflict has a lot of roots in your family of origin. Let me be polemic for just a minute to make a point. Most of us either grew up in households that were very attacking and exploding when it came to conflict, or passive and avoidant when it comes to conflict. Now, I know some of us grew up in a mixture of them, but let me just see a raise of hands. How many of you would say, if I had to pick, I would say my family was a little bit more attacking and exploding? Raise your hand. Okay. And how many of you would say, nope, definitely more passive and withdrawing? More hands are going up there. Ironically, no matter what kind of household you grew up in, the research shows that as you grow older, most of us tend to gravitate towards passive avoiding. Not everybody, but most of us. It's just simpler that way. So John and I, when we were first dating, we weren't even engaged yet. I was working as an administrator at a hospital in Orange County. John was doing his internships for his PhD. And we agreed after work one day to meet at my parents' home in Whittier, California to have dinner, and then we were going to go see a movie. We had a lovely dinner with my parents. We chatted. We left. We got in his old beat-up Volkswagen to go to the movie, and he was kind of uncharacteristically quiet. So I said to him, "Are you okay?" And he said, "Yeah, I'm fine." And I thought, I know what I mean when I say I'm fine, and I'm not fine. So I pushed a little bit more. I said, "You seem quiet." He said, "Well, I do feel a little awkward about the fight." I said, completely confused, "Are we going to have a fight tonight?" And he exasperatingly said, "No, the fight at your parents' house tonight at dinner over the tires." Here's what happened. I was sitting at dinner. My dad asked me, "How was work today?" I said, "Work went great, but when I got out into the parking lot, I had a flat tire." Now, my dad, the only question my father would ever ask me in a situation like that is, "What did you do about it?" And I said, well, I called the auto club. I had to wait 40 minutes for them to show up. When they did, I had them tow it over to Ford-A, and I got a new tire. My dad said, Ford-A? They're way too expensive. We know Jeff at Sears. Next time, have him tow it to Sears and ask for Jeff. You'll get a deal. My mom said, Sears? I always go to Goodyear. That, ladies and gentlemen, was the fight. Now, it didn't even register in my little mind as an awkward conversation. In John, it registered as a fight to the point that he emotionally started shutting down. And I remember sitting in that Volkswagen with a broken heater that was on all the time, thinking, uh-oh, we have a really big gap as to how we see difficult conversations. Now, 6 months later, after we were engaged, true to his nature, he kept thinking about it, and he brought it back up. You remember that conversation we had about the tires? I said, yeah. He said, first of all, I would never even think I had to do anything. I just would think the tire fairy would show up and take care of that. I said, yes, I know that's what you would think. And then he said, if I did what you did, my parents would have looked at me, and in unison they would have said, Johnny, you are the most remarkable child on the face of the earth. And what you've just done is going to go into the Christmas newsletter. In fact, we may start writing it now, even though it's January for next year, because this is profoundly amazing. We had a lot of work in marriage to work on our different views about conflict. All that to say is you as a leader bring a propensity towards your posture when it comes to conflict that's going to take a great deal of work. A couple of resources. There's a great book. You have to have trust on a team in order to do conflict well. Lencioni's book, 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, talks a lot about how you build trust. You primarily build trust through character, competency, and vulnerability. It does not take months to build trust. Part of the way you build trust is by getting results. Stephen Covey has written a fabulous book called The Speed of Trust, and he makes a great case for when you have trust in an organization, you make better decisions and faster decisions that affect profitability. It's a fabulous resource. But I don't want to spend time today on trust. I want to talk about conflict and our ability to face it instead of to lean away from it. How we view conflict very much impacts the speed at which we make decisions, the quality of our decisions, and the development of our people. And that's something else that Christian leaders bring to the table in the business world. We're not just interested in getting the job done, we're also interested in developing our people. So if I could bring that first slide up, I'm going to do just a little bit of work with you from a biology perspective on conflict to get you to understand your own conflict style and your own approach. Conflict is absolutely necessary in organizations. You make terrible decisions when everything isn't out on the table and people aren't passionately debating what the decision should be. But the problem is you and I tend to get stuck either in fight or flight. Everybody put one of your hands up in the air, fold your thumb in, and then fold the rest of your forefingers over your thumb. That's a very rudimentary model of your brain. The 4 fingers over the top represent your cerebral cortex. That is your higher level functioning, reasoning, decision-making abilities. This is where you make great decisions. You process things. You're wise up in this part of your brain. The problem is when you get input, your input always stops first in your midbrain, which is a primitive vestige of your brain that only has 2 options. This part of your brain has all kinds of creative options. This one only has fight or flight. And part of why you hear people sometimes say, if you're feeling angry inside, give yourself a minute or 2 to calm down. What they're describing is actually taking that information and processing it out of your midbrain and forcing it up into your cerebral cortex so you can make a very wise decision. When it stops in your midbrain, you only have 2 choices. You are either primarily a fighter or a flighter. Now, you can vary sometimes, but you're going to have a propensity for one or the other. How many of you would say between fight and flight, you pick fight? Raise your hands. Okay, that's great. It's so funny. In Christian organizations, there's always fewer people that will admit to being fighters. I think you should be proud of it. Guess which one I am. So the problem with fight is your behavior feels like to other people, no matter what it feels like to you inside, no matter how comfortable you are with conflict. To other people, it feels like an attack. Well, you know what happens when people feel like they're under attack? They revert to their midbrain. Everybody now is in the worst possible position to make the best possible decisions about anything. So when you go into fight mode, people shut down, they protect themselves, they withdraw, avoid, and diminish themselves to protect themselves from you, even though you don't feel like that should be happening. And what you create are enemies. You create people that are not on the same page as you. And there becomes in the team a power struggle. And the worst power struggles in the world are the ones that are not obvious. They're going on, but nobody's saying a word. The other group of people tend to be more flight people. How many of you would say, yep, if I had to pick between fight and flight, I would pick flight? Yeah, very common. It's not, neither one of these is better than the other one. It just is. Your job as a leader is to become very aware of your internal sense of yourself and to know, oh, I'm feeling the fight coming up, or oh, I'm feeling the flight going on. And as soon as you become aware of that, you can take steps towards changing it and moving it in a healthy direction. The problem with flight behavior is that it is an avoidant kind of behavior. It withdraws and puts distance between people. Again, worst possible place to make a great decision. And it creates strangers on a team. People who aren't operating on the same page for different reasons and aren't going in the same direction. And it, over time, will create a feeling of apathy on your team when everybody is shutting down and nobody is leaning forward and participating. Your job of a leader is to help everybody on the team recognize where they are in the moment, pull back a little bit, and then get themselves to their cerebral cortex. When you get people thinking up in the higher parts of the brain, you have what God built us for, and that is creative problem solving. It goes back to that Dallas Willard quote. That's what we're created for. We're created for creative problem solving. The behavior begins to be we confide in each other and we collaborate together. Collaboration isn't just an empty word, but it actually starts to mean something. We collaborate and we create allies on a team where we are all pulling in the same direction and we are for each other. And it, over time, creates on a team cohesion and mutual solutions. So recognizing whether you're a fighter or a flighter will make a huge, huge difference. Let me give you an example, and then if I have time, I'll go to our last slide. A couple of years ago, actually it was in 2008, and I don't usually remember years, but it was in the middle of the recession. One of my partners and I were working with a team, not a Christian, it was a business organization. And part of why I remember them was in 2008, they were one of our only clients that had actually grown significantly during the recession. They were up about 35%, which is very unusual, but had created a huge amount of problems. So Kent and I show up, we do a couple of assessments online ahead of time, we bring that with them. We're getting ready to meet with a team for a 2-day initial offsite, and then we come back every month to help embed the work. And this happens often in a consulting situation. Before lunchtime, everybody on the team individually had pulled Kent or I aside to let us know who the problem on the team was. Happens all the time. It's never them. We have never in 10 years had anybody say, you're going to find out very clearly today that I'm the problem on the team, and I know it. So it was clear to us by lunchtime that Lisa was the perceived problem on the team, and even that there is a perceived person as the problem is a systems issue. It's a dynamic that the whole team is dysfunctional, and here's the deal. As soon as you say the word Jesus, you are admitting you are a dysfunctional human being. Otherwise, you wouldn't need him. So again, this is where spiritual formation comes into leadership in such significant and profound ways. We should never be surprised that we're broken. Saddened maybe, but never surprised. Otherwise, we don't need Jesus. So we're working with this team. The first day, we spent a lot of time going through the 5 dysfunctions of a team and talking about how do we overcome them. And we have data and research that we've done on their team so we can show them where their weaknesses are. And where can we overcome that as leaders so that we can become a cohesive team that's on the same page? The second day, we start looking at the mission, vision, strategy, goals, and values, getting clarity on those through a lot of debate, and then integrating the healthy team dynamics with the clarity around what's the business part of the model. So the second day we're talking, and it's a pretty young team. The youngest guy on the team is a guy named Steve. He's probably 28. And on the second day, Lisa is talking, and she's talking in the context of the discussion we're having on strategic anchors. So she's having a conversation with the team on strategy, because that's what we're talking about. And Steve is moving around in his chair like a volcano that's going to explode. And only in the rearview mirror can I now see that he's stuck in his head on some of the stuff we talked about the day before on the necessity of conflict. And he interrupts Lisa in front of the whole team and blurts out, "Lisa, you're a jerk and you never get your work done on time." I'm like, oh, no. no, that's not exactly it. Everybody on the team freezes. Everybody starts looking at their toes. It is really awkward because, as I mentioned, everybody knows that Lisa's part of the problem anyway. It was a very awkward moment. And I remember sitting in my chair thinking, I'm really not sure what to do next. I do hope my partner Kent knows what to do next. And Kent, as the most non-anxious leader I've ever worked with in rare form, just stands up very slowly and chuckles and says, well, that's an interesting statement. Is that true? Now, for a second, he had their eye contact back, and as soon as he said, is it true, everybody looked back at their toes, which as a consultant, you know, pay dirt, must stay in the moment right here. This is where the gold is. Nobody said a word. And so Kent, and I'm still not sure where he's going, takes a red Sharpie marker and goes to the flip chart and writes in the upper left-hand corner, Lisa, you're a jerk, just in case people have forgotten what he said. And I'm thinking, oh, we're so not going to get paid for this job. He writes in the upper right-hand corner, you never get your work done on time. And then he says what I think is one of the wisest and most brilliant statements ever. He says, these are two separate issues. And with your permission, I'd like to tackle the second first. And then we'll come back to the poor way that it got said. Because I'm guessing he said already, Steve has thought of 10 different ways he could have said that. So I'd like to start on the right-hand side with the issue, does Lisa get her work done on time? Now, let me just stop here for a minute. Part of why I'm sharing this story with you is when I get to the end of it, when I experience this, I remember thinking, I just so ache for Christian leaders in the church and in the marketplace to get better at conflict, because I saw what happened to the team dynamics as a result of going through the chaos and the danger. On the other side of it, they emerged more mature, more connected, and more dedicated to having impact than before. It was remarkable. But the problem is we avoid the very thing that's going to take us through to mature us and develop us. So in the moment where it's very hard, and we're in a Christian organization or in a church, if that happened, I can tell you 9 times out of 10 what would happen. Everybody would flutter like little butterflies over to Lisa and pet her and say, oh, honey, did you get your feelings hurt? Or that is so, Steve is such a bad guy. Steve, you are such a bad guy. You're the obvious sinner here. And I got to tell you, Lisa's part of the problem. And you're right, Steve did not say it well. When he said it, I thought, I need your mother's phone number because I don't think your mother taught you to say things like this. But here's the deal. And as Christ followers, we ought to know this better than anybody. If you want people to do something well, you must give them permission to do it poorly. The Apostle Peter, need I say more? Jesus picks him to have the keys to the kingdom. Are you kidding me? From a leadership development standpoint, I got to tell you, when I look at the evidence of the Gospels, Peter is not the top of the list. You must give people permission to do it poorly and not withdraw your connection with them and not punish them and not distance yourself from them and not bring the hand. You need to coach them. And so Kent so wisely said, we are totally going to get to the way he said it. But let's not start there. Let's start with the issue. So then Kent asked them all, does Lisa get her work done on time? Again, nobody would answer. So he just said, okay, we're going to start with you, Fred. And I want to go around in a circle, and here's what I need from every one of you. I need one word answer. I don't need a caveat. I don't need a story. The answer is either yes or no. Oh boy, that was an awkward 60 seconds. The interesting thing was at the end of 60 seconds, only one person said, yeah, she gets her work done on time. And I think that was her BFF, just very mistakenly trying to protect and take care of Lisa. Everybody else around the table said no. Okay, now at this point, who do you think is ready to talk? Yeah, Lisa. That's not a trick question. And if you would have been there, the look on her face was somewhere between mortified and furious. She was fighting back the tears. She was beet red. And she said, first of all, I cannot believe that you guys would wait until we have 2 strangers here to bring this up. That happens all the time when you come in as consultants. People then feel like they have the freedom to say what they've been holding back on for such a long time. And then she said, what makes me even more mad is I can tell by the look on your faces that every single one of you have been talking about this. Well, of course they've been talking about it for a year, behind her back. Lencioni will often say that as Christians, we say we don't want to bring that up because we don't want to hurt her feelings. What we mean is we don't want to hurt her feelings when she's in the room. We're fine hurting your feelings after the meeting or on the phone or in the parking lot or behind closed doors. We have a saying at our church that we're just now getting good at. Believe me, we have such a long way to go. Can we talk to people instead of about people? Check the preposition. Talk to people, not about people. Don't triangulate. Super unhealthy. Great, great book you need to read, A Failure of Nerve. One of the best leadership books I've ever read. It's dense. It's going to take you to places you don't want to go. But he just talks about the unhealth of triangulating. And we all love to be sounding boards, and we all love to hear the dirty news about somebody else. We have to stop that. We have to say, you've just told me I'm going to check with you next Tuesday that you've had a meeting with this person, because if you don't go tell them, I'm going to bring the two of you in a room together. Talk to the person, not about them. So then somebody on the team raises their hand and says, okay, Lisa, is there something going on at home that we don't know about? Because up until about a year ago, you were one of the top performers on the team. Now, at first blush, that sounds like a really sweet thing. And I just raised my hand and said, why would you wait a year to ask that question? Why would you let 365 days go by? And Lisa said, no, there's nothing going on at home. I'll tell you what's happening. We have grown 1/3 in a year. I'm the high-level administrator on this team. Every single one of you is giving me 1/3 more work than you used to do, and I'm dying. Ooh, wow, we just lanced a boil here. Now we have a problem that can be solved. What's Lisa's problem? She went a whole year drowning without raising her hand and say, I need help. That word, that H word, that's very hard for us as leaders to ask for. Ever been in that situation before? Sure. Lisa needs to learn to get better at raising her hand and getting clarity on what the issue is so we can solve the problem. Now, the CEO here is listening to this incredulously saying, how did I miss that? Lisa, we have enough money. We can hire, next week you hire somebody to help you. So we start to do some problem solving because we started with the issue first. Then Kent takes us back to the way it got said. Now, again, not a trick question. By the time 20 minutes go by and we get back to the poor way that Steve said it, how much power do you think had gone out of that? 75%. It was in the right perspective now. Absolutely, Steve said it poorly and probably in the wrong place. But that's not the main issue. The main issue is he's the only person that spoke truth and said it in front of the team so we could solve the problem. To his credit, this young 28-year-old guy, when we got back to the issue, stood up, told Kent to sit down, and said, I'll take it from here. And he looked Lisa in the eye, and he said, first of all, I owe you an apology. I said that so poorly. Let me try again. Here's what I wish I would have said. Lisa, I find myself increasingly frustrated when every week I come into this meeting and everybody else has gotten their work done, but you don't. Now, if you can't hear feedback like that, you don't belong on a leadership team. That's beautifully said. She should be able to hear that. But in his frustration and in the unhealth of the culture, he was encouraged to keep it to himself or talk to all the wrong people about it, so it just sort of spewed out obliquely one time and got all over everybody. It was a pretty profound moment for us as consultants because you started to see really almost even in that moment the change in the dynamics on the team. And I got to tell you, 4 weeks later when we came back, they were just operating at a different level. They had learned so many things about themselves because they had the courage to walk through conflict. There's not going to be a day that goes by in your life at work, in your life with your friends and your loved ones and your family, and in your relationship with God, where leaning into conflict isn't going to eventually, over time, take you to a place of deeper intimacy. I'm going to close with this. How many of you may have read some of the work by Les and Leslie Parrott out of Seattle Pacific University. They're fabulous. They write about marriage. But like A Failure of Nerve, which is a book written about leadership, anything that you can say about family systems also has a lot of implications for organizational systems. And here's what Les Parrott says about conflict. Conflict is the price we pay for a deeper level of intimacy. At the end of the day, conflict really is the only way to intimacy. I think understanding this truth may allow us to have exactly the kind of conversations we need to have. And so my prayer for you as Christ-following leaders is that beyond the impact that you have in the marketplace, which is enormous, and what God created you to do, that you will lean into being a values-driven organization that's unmistakable, and also a culture that leans into conflict for breathtaking results. Thank you.